Excellencies, delegates, members of civil society, I'm honored to deliver the 12th and final report as a special rapporteur for the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. It has been an exceptional privilege to serve in this position and to counter so many valiant champions of human rights, both in Palestine and Israel and elsewhere throughout the world who are engaged in other struggles. The many sacrifices these champions make every day to defend our dignity, enlarge our freedoms, to save our lives, and to protect our planet is an eternal inspiration. Excellencies, the past 6 years, while I have served as Special Rapporteur, have been momentous with regards to developments in the occupied Palestinian territory covered by my mandate. Alas, most of these developments have been disheartening and an affront to our international human rights standards. There have been several periods of intense and destructive violence, with great loss of life and property against the Palestinians under occupation by the Israeli military, particularly in Gaza during the Great March of Return in 2018 and in the short explosive war in Gaza in May 2021. The Israeli occupation, now in its 55th year with no end in sight, has become even more entrenched and repressive. In terms of Palestinian deaths at the hands of the Israeli military, 2021 was the deadliest year since 2014. The instances of settler violence towards Palestinians in 2021 was the highest level of recorded attacks since statistics were first assembled in 2012. And the demolition of Palestinian homes by the Israeli military has been spiking continuously upwards. We must also recognize and condemn the deaths of innocent Israeli civilians during this period. Too much bloodshed on all sides of this occupation has been shed. In 2014, when the last serious peace process efforts under U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry collapsed, there were 370,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank. Today, there are close to 480,000 settlers, an increase of 23%. Add to that the 230,000 Jewish Israeli settlers in Jerusalem, and there are now more than 700,000 Israeli settlers, over 10% of the Israeli Jewish population, living in occupied territory in settlements that the UN Security Council has declared to be a flagrant violation under international law. And in terms of Palestinian civil society and international human rights observers, the news is equally discouraging. In October 2021, Israel designated 6 Palestinian civil society organizations as terrorist organizations and has not rescinded this attack, notwithstanding the consistent statements by member states and international donors that Israel has not presented persuasive evidence to back up its claims. As well, Israel has refused to renew the visas of a number of international staff officers working in the occupied Palestinian territory for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, forcing them to leave the country. This unjustified interference with the legitimate work of the United Nations are actions not worthy of a democracy. The dedicated theme of my 12th report as Special Rapporteur addresses the question of whether Israel's acquisitive and repressive practices over the course of its 55-year-old occupation has curdled from an endless occupation into something darker, harsher, and more ominous. In recent years and months, distinguished voices have concluded that the inexorable facts of Israel's occupation, the relentless land confiscation, the ever-expanding Jewish-only settlements, the dual legal system, the vast gap in living conditions between Israeli settlers and the Palestinians among them, the vast separation in political rights, whether this has amounted to or resembles apartheid. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon wrote in 2021 that Israel's, and I'm quoting, structural domination and oppression of the Palestinian people through indefinite occupation arguably constitutes apartheid. Nobel laureate Desmond Tutu stated in 2014 that, I quote, "I know firsthand that Israel has created an apartheid reality within its borders and through its occupation." South African Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor stated in 2022 that her country's, and again I'm quoting, significant dismay at the continued apartheid practices of Israel against the long-suffering people of Palestine. Has this situation now transformed itself into apartheid? Applying the accepted three-part test from the 1973 UN Convention Against Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the Special Rapporteur has concluded that the political system of entrenched rule in the occupied Palestinian territory satisfies the prevailing evidentiary standard for the existence of apartheid. First, an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination has been established. Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs in East Jerusalem and the West Bank live their lives under a single regime which differentiates its distribution of rights and benefits on the basis of national and ethnic identity, and which ensures the primacy of one group over and to the detriment of the other. The differences in living standards and citizenship rights and benefits are stark, openly discriminatory, and maintained through systematic and institutionalized oppression. Second, this system of alien rule has been established with the intent to maintain the domination of one racial, ethnic, national group over another. Israeli political leaders, past and present, have repeatedly said that they intend to retain control over all of the occupied territory in order to enlarge the blocks of land for present and future Jewish settlement while confining the Palestinians to barricaded population reserves. Under this particular system, the freedoms of one group are inexorably bound up in the subjugation of the other. And third, the imposition of this system of institutionalized discrimination with intent of permanent domination has been built upon the regular practice of inhumane acts. Arbitrary and extrajudicial killings, torture, the violent deaths of children, the denial of fundamental human rights, a fundamentally flawed military court system, and the lack of criminal due process, arbitrary detention, collective punishment, the desperate living conditions in Gaza, the repetition of these acts over long periods of time, and with the endorsement by the Knesset and the Israeli judicial system, indicates that these are not the result of random and isolated acts, but integral to Israel's system of rule. Excellencies, this is apartheid. It does not have some of the same features as practiced in southern Africa. In particular, much of what was called petite apartheid is not present in Israel, in the Palestinian occupied territories. On the other hand, there are pitiless features of Israel's apartheid rule in the occupied Palestinian territory that were not practiced in southern Africa, such as segregated highways, high walls and extensive checkpoints, a barricaded population, missile strikes and tank shelling of a civilian population, and the abandonment of the Palestinian social welfare to the international community. With the eyes of the international community wide open, Israel has imposed on Palestine an apartheid reality in a post-apartheid world. As I conclude, I want to address one of the most important and neglected issues dealing with the Israeli occupation of Palestine: the remarkable unwillingness of the international community to impose any accountability measures on Israel for its forever occupation, which has been conducted both in absolute defiance of international law and with the eyes of the international community wide open. The United Nations Security Council has adopted over 30 resolutions over the past 40 years critical of Israel and its occupation. The General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have, in addition, adopted hundreds more resolutions. The Israeli settlements are illegal. Annexation is illegal. The denial of Palestinian self-determination is illegal. Human rights abuses are rife. The Fourth Geneva Convention applies in full. None of these countless resolutions have been obeyed by Israel, and nothing has been imposed on Israel to bring it into compliance with the rules-based international order. Let me be clear. The problem regarding Palestine and the United Nations forums has never been that the UN passes too many resolutions, but that it does too little to enforce any of these resolutions. Excellencies, I would not be here in front of you today delivering a report on how an unrelenting occupation has metastasized into apartheid if the international community had taken its own laws seriously 45 and 35 years ago when the Security Council and the General Assembly began to adopt the first of their many resolutions critical of the Israeli occupation. International law is not meant to be an umbrella that folds up at the first hint of rain. Had the international community accompanied these resolutions with resolute accountability and consistency decades ago, in the same way that it is doing today with the invasion and occupation of Ukraine, then we would have likely have had a just and durable solution to the question of Palestine many years ago, and nobody would have to be talking about apartheid today. Thank you very much.